Good evening. How are y'all doing? Good. I was doing that on purpose because not everybody can answer how you're doing at the same time, can you? We greet people in a lot of different ways. Sometimes our greeting is something that is meaningful. Maybe we haven't seen someone, we know them well, haven't seen them in a while, and so when we go to greet them, there's a little bit more thought and perhaps more feeling involved in it. We may shake hands, we may give someone a hug, but there's always going to be words exchanged, communication going back and forth. On the other hand, sometimes we greet people that we see very regularly, and maybe we don't even think about what we say. We might walk past someone on the street, at least here in the South, and say, "How you doing?" We're not really asking, "How are you feeling?" We're not intending for you to stop for 15 minutes and tell us exactly how you do. That's not the purpose, and we all know that. So somebody says, "How you doing?" Oftentimes you don't even say, "I'm doing well," or things are going great. You just do it back. "How are you doing?" And you just keep on going because it's just a common greeting. We deal with common greetings all the time. I wonder how people greeted Jesus. Have you ever met someone that you really looked up to, that you thought was a very important person for some reason or another? Maybe it was somebody who was just famous, like an entertainer. If your favorite entertainer happened to be in the area and you see them, have you watched some people, when they get close to them, it's like they can't breathe. They get up close to them and they've got all these things they want to say, and what comes out is a little bit of gibberish. And then the person goes on and they're going, "Oh man, I could have said a dozen different things that would have been great, but I didn't do it. I just fell apart when the time came." Well, that's just somebody who's famous. What about somebody who's important to you? Somebody that you really look up to and admire. Somebody that you think is maybe doing things that are great in this life, great for other people. So you really look up to them, and then you get the chance to greet them. And what do you say? What questions are you going to ask? What statements are going to be put forth from you to the other person? Oftentimes when we think about Jesus, we're thinking about what people were thinking maybe, what they saw him do, what they heard him say. I wonder what people said to him. We get to read a few things. We read a few details here and there about what someone said to him when they met him face to face. But it's different when you're looking at someone that you maybe look up to or admire or something. It's different when they finally look at you. We think about Jesus and the miracles. We think about the great teachings that he did, the ones that we do get to read, the Sermon on the Mount, and what his disciples, what the people must have been thinking and feeling as they were sitting there looking at Jesus. And when we look back or think back to that time and we make statements like, "I wish I could have been there to see him. What if I'd been there for him to see me?" Because encountering someone, in this sense of looking at Jesus, of encountering Jesus, is not just about me seeing him, it's about him seeing me as well. Both are involved. Would you have enjoyed that idea? Do you look back and think, "I would have loved to have been there, been able to see him, watch him walk across the street, listen to him speak, watch a miracle that he performed"? But what would Jesus have been doing had he seen me? What would he have said to me? What words would have come across? I was reading something the other day, just some estimation. It's not exact figures, so don't quote anybody on this because it's not my numbers anyway. I was reading them from someone who did some research and looked into it about how far Jesus would have walked in his lifetime. Now, this is from the time he was no longer an infant being carried, but would have been able to walk as they traveled from place to place as a family. And then later, as you come to his ministry, his work, about 3.5 years toward the end of his life, right before he was crucified, they were tracing the journeys that we read in Scripture as to where he went, how far this was. Sometimes it's told to us, sometimes it's not. How long it took them to get there. Again, sometimes that's given, sometimes it's not. But when you start reading the number of steps, the number of miles he would have covered, Their estimation was that in his lifetime, he would have covered almost 25,000 miles, either traveling by foot or in a cart, in a wagon, however they were traveling. That's almost going around the entire world at the equator. Almost. In his work, in his ministry, the last 3 to 3.5 years of his life, they estimated that he would have covered over 3,000 miles, most of which, when we're told he was walking. 3,000 miles. That's a long way to cover by foot. And how much of that time was spent in the presence of people? You know, every once in a while we read that Jesus went off by himself, that he went to be alone. He went and prayed. He went to the wilderness to be tempted by himself. There are a few times we read about him being by himself. Most of the time, somebody was with him. Most of the time, several somebodies were with him. His disciples, these apostles. Sometimes it was only a few of them. Sometimes it was all of them. Many times it was all of them. And in many cases, we're reading about him encountering other people along the way. And that's what this whole study has been about. If you're reading in Luke 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, we're studying from chapter 17 tonight. But several chapters leading up to this, all the way back to chapter 9, it tells us that he had set his sights, his purpose, his footpath, if you will. He had set his goal on going to Jerusalem. Well, it took him a while to get there on this journey, at least. He had been to Jerusalem. He had been to Galilee. He had been to Jerusalem. He had been to Galilee. You're talking about a 240-mile round trip. Every time he went to Galilee and then came back to Jerusalem, or left going back and forth, either way. About 120 miles, so about 240 miles round trip each time he did this. Well, from chapter 9 all the way to 17, we keep reading chapter 9, chapter 13, again in chapter 17, that he's going to Jerusalem. That's his goal. That's where his intent is to end up, is in Jerusalem. And so he's going, and he keeps dealing with people. He keeps talking to people. Well, at some points he's talking to disciples. If you look back in chapter 15, it says that the Pharisees and the scribes were hearing what he was saying. They were disturbed by what he was saying, and so they talk to him, and he speaks to them. And there's a lot of teaching that goes on. In chapter 15, it says that he gives 3 parables: the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the prodigal son. You get into chapter 16, and what takes place? He keeps on teaching. And specifically, he's talking to his disciples then. And he's talking to them about not just parables and pictures, but about characters, about people. Notice when he tells parables, when he tells stories, when he talks to them about things, he's talking about people. Even if it's a parable where it's an idea of people, or whether he's giving a literal account of something where he's talking about specific people, he's always dealing with people. That's what he came to do, isn't it? Jesus came here so that he could die on a cross. But as Jesus was journeying from birth to the cross, he lived among men. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, is the writing of John. He lived among people. And during those 3 to 3.5 years before he was crucified, he was working with people, seemingly nonstop. He was either dealing with his followers, or dealing with his enemies, or dealing with strangers that he was meeting along the way. He was dealing with people over and over again. By chapter 17, he's teaching his disciples some principles, some great teaching here. He ends up the chapter 16 talking about the idea of a master, a servant, unjust handling and using of one another. Chapter 17, he starts talking about sin and the idea of forgiveness. What does he say first of all in the first couple of verses of chapter 17? He says, don't be the offense for the other person. What does it mean biblically to offend someone? It means to put a stumbling block in their way. That's right. It means to cause them to stumble. To be an offense is more, it does entail some of the idea that we use today, but when we say someone offended me today, what do we normally mean? They hurt my feelings. I didn't like what they were saying. I didn't like what they were doing. It bothers me. They hurt my feelings. Well, there's part of that in the biblical word offense, because it is hurtful to our feelings if we're wanting to do right and somebody throws a stumbling block in front of us, but it's more than that. You have to build on that. It's the idea of a stumbling block that would cause someone to commit sin. So, yes, it bothers me personally. Yes, I don't like what they're doing personally. But more than that, I'm hurt by what they did to me spiritually. He says, offenses are going to come, but don't be the person through whom those offenses come. You don't want to be the offender. You don't want to be the one throwing the stumbling block. And then, then building on that idea, he says, not only do you not want to be causing people to commit sin, you don't want to be holding people in sin. If your brother sins against you, and rebuke him. If he repents, do what? Forgive him. Do you know, I've said it over the years, I've heard others say it over the years, that repentance is probably the hardest command that we have to deal with, at least on a regular basis. I've kind of revised that a little bit in my thinking. I think forgiveness is. You know, on another account of this discussion, Jesus tells Peter 70 times 7. Well, first, 7 times. Do this 7 times. That's here in Luke 17. If you go to Matthew's account, Peter says, do we do this 7 times? And Jesus says 70 times 7. So what you're gaining from this by putting the two together is Jesus is the one that said 7 times. Jesus is the one that said this is not just a one-time thing. If he does this 7 times in a day and 7 times in a day turns to you saying, I repent, forgive him. And in the other account, in Matthew's account, Peter asks, do we do it up to 7 times? And Jesus says 70 times 7. How hard is it for us to forgive one wrong? To forgive a wrong. Which, by God's definition of forgiveness, means to forgive it and never bring it up again. It doesn't mean when we read that he will remember their sins and iniquities no more, does that mean once we have been forgiven that it's gone from God's memory? Is that what that means? God forgets literally? It's not in his mind anymore? So now we're just a righteous person in front of God and he doesn't even recognize that we've been cleansed? Of course he does. It's not talking about a wiping of the mind of God. It's talking about accountability. He will remember them no more. They won't be brought up again in a legal manner. They will not face you again like they would have if you were not cleansed. He says if he repents 7 times in a day, forgive him. Don't be the one to cause someone to sin. Don't be the one who will still hold someone guilty in sin. If he repents, forgive him. It's interesting to me that immediately on the heels of this statement, what we read from the disciples is, Lord, increase our faith. You know why? Because forgiving someone is hard for us. It takes a special effort from us. Even though we realize, I too have sinned, I have wronged people, I have been and will in the future, if time continues and I keep living, I will need forgiveness from someone else. It's still hard for us to grant it and to grant it the way God does. It's not going to be a problem in our relationship. I'm not going to bring it up again. This is not going to be an issue. Forgiveness or unforgiving attitude is a difficulty here. He goes on to discuss with them not just the idea of an unforgiving attitude, but then he discusses with them a little bit further the unworthy servant. Because who are we after all? If you're not willing to forgive your fellow servant, if you're not willing to forgive your fellow man, then who are you? Because we all are unworthy servants. He says if you serve in the field and then you come in from the field, what does your master say to you then? Hey, it's time for you to sit down and kick up your heels and let somebody else take care of you. No, you're still a servant. So you come in, you still serve the master in whatever his needs are, and then when his needs are all met, then you can eat. Then you can have what you need. That's the nature of being a servant. And at the end of the day, we are unprofitable servants. Do you know what that means, unprofitable? It means you don't gain anything through your service. You know, that's a hard concept for us to fathom, that you work and you serve and you do, and in all of that you do not earn. Why? Because our whole life is built around working and serving and doing and earning, making a living. But this idea is going beyond making a living. He's talking about a servant-master relationship. And in the servant-master relationship, the servant does not become a master by serving. He's still a servant. And it's his duty to do what the master tells him to do. And at the end of the day, that's just the relationship. You're still unprofitable. So we get down to verse 11. At the end of verse 10, you'll notice there's a bit of a break. In verse 11, it starts off with another phrase, letting us see this break. Now it happened as he went to Jerusalem. There's actually a time span, a gap here that we often see in Scripture, or sometimes we don't see. It looks like things are running just one right after another. There's actually a gap. If you read in John's account, you read John 11 and those events right around it taking place in between verse 10 and verse 11 of chapter 17 here in Luke. So he goes to Bethany and takes his disciples there, waiting on purpose, enough time for Lazarus to have died and been buried. He goes and raises him from the dead. All the conversation, the encounters that take place there. And then we pick up and read here, he's on his way to Jerusalem. And on his way to Jerusalem, passing through one of the villages here in the midst of Samaria and Galilee, Jesus is traveling. Where's Samaria? Samaria is just north of Israel. Where's Galilee? Galilee's on the north side of Samaria. So he's going to Jerusalem, but he's not going directly to Jerusalem. He's not going straight to Jerusalem, as we would say. He's not going from point A to point B on a map. He's traveling, going back north again on his way to Jerusalem. And as he's passing through one of these villages, one of these towns, it says there are 10 lepers. So as we're reading these teachings, we're reading what Jesus is doing, having to face the Pharisees and the scribes, dealing with his disciples, and now he comes to a place where there are 10, from what we can see here, 10 complete strangers. But they have a common identifying factor. They are lepers. As we go down through this, a distinction is going to be made by Jesus that should, socially, it should, genetically, looking at their seed line, looking at their social status, should have separated these people, at least one of them, from the rest of the group. He identifies him later on in this text as a Samaritan. Now, a foreigner, a stranger. As he does this, it's setting him at odds with the 9, which likely means the 9 were Jews, were Israelites. So here is Israelite Jesus. Israelite Jesus is in Samaria, is in Galilee. He's not in Israel. He's in the foreign country, but when he's in the foreign country and comes across these 10 lepers, one of them is a Samaritan. Likely, by saying that, the other 9 are Israelites. Why aren't they in Israel? Because they're lepers. This idea of them having leprosy is monumental to this situation. We have to understand what's going on to understand the point of this encounter. Their disease had brought them together when nothing else would have. Israelites did not want to live in Samaria. They didn't want to be surrounded by Samaritans. If Samaritans were in Israel, they were not only foreigners, they were viewed in the sense of a foreigner is an enemy. A foreigner is an outcast. A foreigner should not be considered like us. They hated the Samaritans because of several historical issues and the mixing of the bloodlines. And so Jesus is here, and these 10 cry out to him. You'll notice it says, if you read verse 11 and verse 12, that these 10 people, 10 lepers, stood afar off. Why did they stay afar off? They were separated from society for a reason. They were social distancing. Hey, look at that. We put it to a good use. They were in the grips of what the Bible calls a plague. We would call it an epidemic. It was something that was contagious. It was deadly. And God dealt with this all the way back in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus chapters 13 and 14, I would urge you to read through that. If you can, maybe later tonight before bed or tomorrow if you have time. Leviticus 13 and 14 is still viewed by many medical professionals as the best literature regarding leprosy that has ever been written. Does that astound you? God wrote it. Should be well understood that He knows what He's talking about. And what was it when a person had leprosy? When they were diagnosed, if they had a scab, if they had a sore, an open wound, by law they had to go to the priests, let them examine them, and if it was determined that they had leprosy, immediately. It did not matter what your status was in your community. It did not matter whether you were married or not, had children. How would you like it if one day you woke up, you went to the doctor, and the doctor said, from this point, right now, when you walk out of my office, you're an outcast. You go outside the city, and I don't mean go to the suburbs and go to a housing community. I mean you go out to a place where nobody else is, and you live there. Somebody will come every once in a while, not close to you. They'll come out in the area where you are, and they will leave you food. They will leave you clothing. They will leave you medical supplies. They'll leave you whatever you're going to need, and you will stay a certain distance away from them. You will stay downwind from them instead of upwind. And if anybody starts to get too close, they will know who you are because you will have a covering over your mouth at all times. And when they start to get close, you will shout to them, unclean, unclean, to make sure they are warned and they keep a proper distance away, because this is communicable. It is deadly. I read somewhere several years ago warning hunters about armadillos, not to handle armadillos out in the wild because they carry leprosy. When I first read that, I was a teenager. I heard leprosy and I thought Bible. Well, there are different forms of leprosy. You can get sick from touching a dead armadillo. You can get a form of leprosy. It's not what these people were dealing with. This was a different disease, a stronger disease that was body-threatening and then after a while life-threatening. And so they were to keep away from everybody, and they were doing what they were supposed to do. As Jesus passes through, they stay afar off and they cry out to Him. It does not say they approached Him. It does not say He approached them. They kept a proper distance, and He did too. So their disease brought them together. Their desire brought them to Jesus. Notice, they saw Him, and they didn't approach Him. They cried out to Him, asking Him to have mercy on them. So the disease that was plaguing them, like it would anybody, caused a great desire. Here is Jesus, who is traveling around this whole area, and in many cases, He's healing sick people. In fact, knowing the timeline of what has just happened, He has just been in Bethany and called a dead man out of a tomb. No, He didn't. He called a living man out of a tomb. He told Lazarus, come forth. And Lazarus walked out of there alive. Had been dead and buried for 4 days. Remember the warning they gave him? Oh, we don't want to roll that stone away. We don't want to take that away. He stinks already. Lazarus, come forth. A man that can call a dead man back to life to come walking out of the tomb surely can heal. And they knew this as well. He had been places and healed so many people. Go back to Luke chapter 8 and you read instances and the statement of how many people Jesus was healing. He was known far and wide, from Galilee all the way down to Jerusalem, as the miraculous healer. So this is not strange that they see Jesus and their mind goes to the idea, He can take care of this for us. He can heal us. And so they cry out to Him, and their statement to Him is, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. This word master is not the word that we would think of them saying, we're your disciples, we know you, we have relationship with you. This is the same master that's used by Peter when Jesus comes on the scene early on and tells them to go fishing again. And He calls him master. And what does Jesus say to him? We fished all night and we haven't caught anything. So here this wandering, walking stranger comes up to a group of commercial fishermen who fish these waters all the time for a living, know exactly what they're doing, and He says, go out and drop your nets again. Why? Why would we listen to you? He calls him master. Not because of relationship yet. It was a term of respect for someone you met, you didn't know, but you look to them and think they look like they have authority, they look like they have some presence, some power, so you greet them with something that shows respect. That's what Peter did. That's what these 10 do. Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. So their disease brought them together when they would not have normally been together. A Samaritan with 9 Jews outside of Israel, this would not have been a normal situation. It was a sickness that caused it. But their desire for healing caused them to do something together. All 10 of them are in this. They are all diseased with the same disease. That's why they can be together. And all 10 of them have the same desire. Who would not have had that desire? To have this taken away. So then, as we're looking at the 10 and realizing why they're together, realizing why they're crying out to Jesus, they're focused on this one who's out there, afar off. They're crying out to Him. And what they get a great picture of next is His deity. His deity brought them to health. Notice, Jesus did not do what He did in some cases and touch someone. He did not walk right up to them and talk to them face to face, like we would say, someone very close in proximity. They're afar off crying out. He tells them what? Go show yourself to the priests. You remember Naaman? 2 Kings 5? Naaman was told, go dip yourself 7 times in the Jordan. Naaman was wroth. He was angry. I expected, remember, you know the phrase, behold, I thought. I thought this man of God would come out, would say some great things, would strike the air with his hand, and my leprosy would be gone. I already had built up in my mind what was going to happen, and when that's not what happened, he was going home angry and still a leper. Until one of his servants talked some sense into him and said, if he'd bid you to do some great thing or pay some great sum, what would you not have done? He's telling you to do something simple. Why wouldn't you go do it? So he goes to the Jordan. Do you know what Naaman looked like the 6th time he came up out of the water? Same way he looked the first time he came up out of the water. And the 2nd, and the 3rd. He had to obey, which meant 7 times. And when he came up the 7th time, he was clean. The leprosy was gone. These men were told, go show yourselves to the priests. What was the purpose of going to the priests? To be pronounced clean. We would think of it today as having been sick, going back to the doctor and receiving a clean bill of health. What was bothering you is gone. It's not there anymore, and the doctor signs off on it. You ever been sick and had to be off work, out of school, and you have to have a doctor's excuse, And sometimes, depending on a sickness, you might have to have another doctor's note saying, this person's well. They don't have this anymore. That's exactly what they were doing. They had to go to the priests when they had the first thing show up and be declared a leper and be cast out. And if it ever was gone for whatever reason, they had to go back to the priests first. They could not go home first. They could not go hug their spouse or their children. They couldn't run back to where they used to work and tell the boss, hey, I'm going to be back at work soon. The first thing they had to do was go, in our mind, go to the doctor. They had to go to the priests. And the priests had to examine them thoroughly and declare them clean. When Jesus told them, go show yourselves to the priests, what did they still have? Leprosy. If that were you or me, if we were in that position, and he said, go show yourself to the priest, what would you do? I know what I would do. The first thing I would do is look. Is it still there? He just told me to go to you only go to the priest when you think you're clean. It's still there. But it says that all 10 of them obeyed him. And as they went, their leprosy was healed. Jesus did not have to touch them. He didn't have to say anything, did he? But what he did say was not some great powerful thing and strike the air with his hand. He did not make some big show. He told them, you're following the law being out here where you are, staying afar off. Follow the law and go to the priests. And as they went, they were healed. The deity of Jesus was always there for people to see. The power that he had that was divine in its nature, something that nobody could do without God. Which is why many times, Nicodemus, what did Nicodemus say about Jesus? What was his estimation of Jesus? We know that God is with you, or else you couldn't do the things that you do. What Nicodemus wasn't understanding yet was it wasn't just that God was with him, but that you're God who became flesh. When Jesus asked his disciples in the coast of Caesarea Philippi, whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? What answers did they come up with? Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets? Do you know, if I ask somebody, what is it that people are saying about me? And they said, they think you're Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets, I would be ecstatic if they would equate me to one of them, because I know a lot about them. Faithful men of God stood up in difficult times when they thought sometimes they were standing all alone, preaching God's word, telling the people what was right, condemning sin. These were good men. They weren't Jesus, and they weren't his equal. And so he asked them, whom do ye say that I am? That's what they're saying about me, but you're with me day in and day out. You hear me, you see me, you've been instructed and brought along further in many things than these others have. What do you say? And Peter's answer was very plain. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. These men got to see the deity of Jesus at work, even though they weren't still standing there looking at Jesus. They were not still afar off wanting to go to him, wanting to reach out to him. He had already told them, go show yourself. And they went. And as they went, they were healed. The deity of Jesus brought them to healing. And what happened with this encounter? There are 10 responses to this encounter with Jesus, because there are 10 people. There are 10 responses to this encounter with Jesus. 9 of them we don't get much detail about. They just kept going to the priests. They were headed to the priests. They were healed. They kept going to the priests. I have no doubt if we read more detail about them, what we read was they went, or would have read, was they went back to the priests, showed themselves, were pronounced clean, and went home. They went home. They went to their families. They went to their job. They went to their community. They could walk down the street and see someone, I don't know if they did that in this culture or not, but if they saw someone that they had not seen for a long time because they'd been out there sick, they could run up to them and embrace them. They could shake hands. They could hug a neck. They could kiss a cheek. They could take their child and bounce them on their knee. They could sit down at a table with their family at dinner. Do you understand? Do I understand what it would have meant to them to look down and recognize that Jesus has made me whole and I can live again? I can understand their mindset, but I can still understand how wrong it is. There are 9 responses that we don't read any details about, just the fact that they kept going. But we read about one response in this encounter. This man turned. How do you think he went back to Jesus? We read a number of situations about somebody who's healed, like a lame person healed, and now they're able, he says, pick up your bed and walk, and they do. And we read about leaping and shouting and rejoicing and praising. And we read a number of things about somebody having a disease, a sickness, a malady taken away, and their jubilant attitude. I bet when he came back to Jesus, he was running. I bet he was sprinting. Arms over his head, probably looked like he had lost his mind if somebody was off to the side seeing this. He's walking with 9 other people. All of a sudden, he peels back and he goes to Jesus. And what does he do when he comes to Jesus? He falls at his feet. Why? I've met some pretty impressive people in my lifetime. I have never met anybody that just being there in their presence and maybe knowing what they have done or are doing, I've never met anybody that made me want to just fall at their feet. What do we think of when we think of falling at somebody's feet? We generally think of worship. There are times we read about someone falling at another person's feet, like Peter, and Peter telling them, I'm a man like you, get up. Cornelius, don't do that. No, you're not going to worship me. I'm not the one to be worshiped, which is exactly what Peter should have done, because he was not to be worshiped. You will never find Jesus in a personal encounter with someone telling them, get up, you're not supposed to worship me. You'll never find that, because he was to be worshiped. He was worthy of worship. He was God in flesh. And when deity brought these men to their healing, then we see this man's mindset, we see his attitude, we see his gratitude. He comes rushing to Jesus and he falls at his feet and he worships and praises God. And what did Jesus ask him? Where are the 9? If you want to have an encounter with Jesus, it's not going to be like this. It's never going to be 5 minutes. No. It's never going to be like this, for the simple reason that Jesus is not flesh on earth anymore. We will never have this kind of encounter. If you want to have the encounters that God allows us to have by faith, by what we read about Jesus, what we know about Him, then think about Him as a human being, as a man, among men. Yes, always remember, never forget that He is the Word who became flesh, but never forget the flesh. What do you think the look on Jesus' face was when He saw this man coming? And what do you think the look on His face was when He asked the question, where are the 9? Why is only one of you? Why are you the only one right here, right now, doing this? There should have been 10 running over each other, getting to Jesus, to thank Him, to show gratitude, to worship God. But there was one. I have heard all my life people say, if I could have been there to see one of those miracles, oh, what it would have done to me. I'll tell you, if it doesn't do that to you reading about them and understanding them, it wouldn't do it to you if you were standing there watching it, or even if you were a recipient of it. Encountering Jesus, yes, always had something to do with who Jesus was, but encountering Jesus and the effects from it always had to do with who the individual was. It's one thing to say, oh, to see Jesus, oh, to hear Jesus, oh, to see a miracle that Jesus had performed. Yes, that's Him. But there's always another party and an encounter, and that's me, or you, or whoever it is that's there at the time. The fact is, we get to encounter Jesus anytime we want to. We don't have to, like these men, be sitting there waiting, and when we see Him afar off, crying out to Him because we can't rush over to Him. We don't have to wait until He happens to come to our community. We don't have to lace up our sandals and take off several days' journey to go catch up to where Jesus is going and teaching and healing and doing the things He's doing. It's the most simple thing for us. All we have to do is sit down and crack a book. We don't have to go out in the heat or out in the cold. We don't have to go deal with strangers. We don't have to do any of those things to go find Jesus. We have an encounter, if we choose to, anytime we want to sit down and open the book. And like this man who encountered Jesus, there were 9 more who encountered Him and kept walking. Oh, they were touched by Him. Yes, His deity was there, healed them of a dreaded disease, allowed them to go back home and go about their life. And one of them turned around and came back, because the encounter was not just about Jesus. The encounter is about the other person too. I would dare say that if Jesus came to earth again, He would change a lot of lives in the encounters that would ensue. And then there would also be so many more that encounter would do nothing for. Look at the ones who got to hear Him and see Him. The Pharisees who were hearing what He was saying. The scribes that were watching the miracles He was performing. They were seeing all of this too. And when He taught them about money, it says they were covetous people. So they derided Him because He talked to them about the things that they were guilty of doing. Did the encounter with Jesus benefit them? No. Not unless you are a person who's going to be benefited by encountering Jesus. We can read all the encounters, and you're covering a good many of them throughout this summer. It's a wonderful study. Understand, the encounter is only beneficial if the individual is open to be benefited. Do you encounter Jesus? What has He done for you? What are you receiving at His hand? And how are you responding to it? We all get to encounter Jesus if we choose to. And we all get to benefit from that encounter again if we choose to. Thank you so much for your time.